The cemetery committee of Flaxborough had for some time thought of itself as the town's most unsung theatre. It met monthly in a grey upstairs room of the municipal buildings, a chamber whose glazed paint had long ago conceded a glossless truce with nicotine and years. It was furnished with a map of the town in railway engine black and an urn that emitted tea the colour of varnished beech. The audience, a few councillors not on the committee but scenting influence, a pair of ladies from the Women's Guild, who rotated between committees according to where the biscuits were best, and the editor of the Flaxborough Citizen in person, attended as much for recreation as oversight. On this wet Wednesday, in early October, the business was drainage. Mr. Lenrick Blee, Superintendent of Cemeteries, sat before the committee with a farm ledger in which he kept his notions. He was a neat, gloomy man, born apparently into overalls and a sense of grievance. He had been trying to explain that graves in Section D were, to use the technical expression he employed with pleasure, wet. The vicar, the Reverend Basil Chubb, had conceded this on pastoral grounds. Reverend Chubb's curate was forever stumbling on spongy earth during burials, and on 2 occasions had returned from graveside prayers with shoes that made a sound like apology. Councillor Lionel Gearhart, a man whose drapery business had clothed several generations of Flaxborough in garments of conservative reliability, had chaired the meeting into its 3rd cup of reconstituted tea. Perhaps, he had explained to Blee, if we accepted your recommendation for a subsoil drain, there would be an expectation that Section C might be next. Precedence, Mr. Blee, get out of bed to take money away. Mrs. Ivy Butterwith, who chaired nothing but rearranged everything, called heaven to witness that the dead must have dryness as a right. Wetness, she declared, is forever the undoing of hems. I say that as a daughter of laundresses. The town clerk, Mr. Mostyn Crisp, a tidy survivor of many committees and wars, thought of his pencil stubs. He also thought of the minutes, their endless pages long past any reasonable proportion to human life. It was therefore with the gratitude of the saved that he turned his attention to a clerk who had materialized by the door with a brown wrapped parcel and a small frown. Mr. Crisp, the clerk whispered, as if parcels were prone to scandal. Gearhart noticed the interruption and, by reflex, turned it into ceremony. Some communication. The porter says this is for the committee, said the clerk. Delivered at the porter's lodge, no sender. Several members adopted facial arrangements for receiving gifts. Mr. Blee took on a look that foretold nails and hinges. He recognized the shape of certain kinds of trouble. "Open it, Mr. Crisp," said Gearhart, and accelerated the honour by rising fractionally. The town clerk placed the parcel on the table. He did not, being a professional, tear. The string was untied as if it might remember and be wanted again. Paper was folded rather than crumpled. Within lay straw, and within the straw, brass. There were 13 of them, each in a separate tissue wrapper, like butter wrapped against dust. "Coffin plates," said Mr. Obed Puckle, the undertaker, who had attended by right and by habit. His grave whisper imparted a proprietary music to the words. Mr. Puckle was small, black-suited, and very conscious of fittings. Very nicely finished. Mortlake's work, if I'm not mistaken, that satin feel to the engraving. Mr. Crisp, the Secretary of Crises, lifted the topmost plate. Brass warmed in his fingertips. The engraving declared, Percival Fordle, 1879-1932 at peace. He picked up the next, Percival Fordle, 1879-1932, calmly gone to his rest interred 7th December. Another, identical in name and years, but with interred, 9th December. Then one with November, and one with a rather more unsettling, laid to rest, 2nd December, with his ancestors. The 4th plate read, At rest beside his dear mother. The 5th read, Too soon. Mr. Puckle, who knew his sentiments as well as his sizes, sniffed faintly. Too soon is usually for lambs. 33 is not an age at which one's ambitions are extinguished, perhaps, but the sentiment is poorly placed on a man of the 30s. He paused, then helpfully added, "One prefers a sober at rest after 40. The Reverend Chubb leaned forward and then backward with the gentle motor of a man whose opinions had to consult committee decency before being admitted. "I cannot say I have met with Mr. Fordle in my registers," he confessed to the ceiling, "but that is no disproof of his existence." A small card lay at the bottom of the box. It was visiting card-sized and unembellished, save for a printing that managed to be both neatly centered and accusatory. The Bloodline buried 13 times. "Childish," said Gerhardt, but in a way that unconsciously included prudence and perhaps a little fright. Mrs. Butterworth, whose face could be counted upon to register feelings on behalf of all present, created an expression that combined disapproval, curiosity, and capacity. "Percival Fordle," mused Mr. Crisp. "That is a name one might dust and find something beneath. There was a Fordle in drapery once," he added politely, and glanced at Gerhardt. Gerhardt looked gratified, and above it, Mr. Blee made a dry throat sound. "There is a Fordle row," he said, "in Section B toward the U's. They were in hats. The old hats. Tall uns. Hatter," corrected Mr. Puckle with tender indignation. "Hatters, Mr. Blee. In hats is the condition. In hatting is the trade." The town clerk sat back, his hands steepled in a private liturgy. "Is there an offence in sending coffin plates through the post?" "Not of themselves," he answered himself. "The intent is perhaps the matter. The intent seems to allude to unauthorized burial, or to some mischief with dates, or to a point that the committee cannot hope to comprehend with the help of rich tea biscuits." He looked rather hopefully at the superintendent of police, who was not there. In his stead, however, sat a small incident. Inspector Pubright, who had come to speak to Mr. Crisp after the meeting about a proposed police notice board that would be, in Mr. Crisp's scheme, in no way associated with clutter. Pubright had been waiting in the corridor in the manner of a man who did not believe in doorways as thresholds to drama. Now he was invited in, and took a chair near a ficus that looked as if its leaves had been ironed. Inspector Pubright was a mild-looking man with an expression of educational concern. The town had learned that the expression could precede either a useful question or, on rare occasions, a quiet arrangement for someone's arrest. His hair was tidy, not because he arranged it, but because it arranged itself. He regarded the 13 brass plates that lay like goldfish in a pail. "Odd," he said. This was not a judgment, merely a recognition that the world had stepped half an inch outside habit. "Is it wicked?" asked Mrs. Butterworth, whose vocabulary divided the universe like washing. "It is," said Pubright. "An inconvenience to the sense of order. One must begin there." He lifted one of the plates, as if weighing not the metal, but the sentiment, and laid it back among its fellows with the carefulness of a man returning a volume to the right shelf. "I shall have Sergeant Love make a note," he continued. "In the meantime, might someone direct me to Section B, the Fordle row? I will take a look after luncheon." He glanced with scholastic modesty at the Reverend. "And perhaps, Mr. Chubb, your registers when the day is past shouting." The Reverend Chubb, who had not shouted for years, blushed. Mr. Crisp, moderate relief, breathing through him like a stove, nodded. "Very good, Inspector. We shall minute that the police have been advised." Horace Plumbly, of the Flaxborough Citizen, had been scribbling phrases with the professional pleasure of a man who enjoyed the noise pencil made on paper. He had already produced mysterious parcel to council, brass warning to committee, and cemetery drama casts pal over drainage. He considered Bloodline and discarded it as too vampiric. Out in the corridor, the clerk who had brought the parcel was taken aside by Mr. Blee. "Who delivered?" asked Blee. "Boy on a bicycle," said the clerk. "Cap pulled down, said, 'For the committee,' and pushed off before I could advise him into civility." The clerk could advise many people into civility, always the same advice, always with diminishing effect. Pubright, who overheard without any visible attempt to do so, looked at the parcel wrapping. The brown paper had a faint trace of something that was not dust. Furniture polish. It had the particular perfumed smugness of drawing-room cleanliness. He did not touch the paper again. He had seen enough of it. Instead, he stooped to retrieve one of the tissue papers that had slipped to the floor and saw, on its torn edge, the small red smear, not of blood, but of sealing wax, the old-fashioned sort anyone could buy at the stationer's if they wanted their mischief to have dignity. He did not comment. Instead, he asked Mr. Puckle, who was hovering in proprietorial mourning, "Mortlake, did you say?" "Odd," he said. This was not a judgment, merely a recognition that the world had stepped half an inch outside habit. "Is it wicked?" asked Mrs. Butterworth, whose vocabulary divided the universe like washing. "It is," said Pubright, "an inconvenience to the sense of order. One must begin there." He lifted one of the plates as if weighing not the metal but the sentiment, and laid it back among its fellows with the carefulness of a man returning a volume to the right shelf. "I shall have Sergeant Love make a note," he continued. "In the meantime, might someone direct me to Section B, the Fordle Row? I will take a look after luncheon." He glanced with scholastic modesty at the Reverend. "And perhaps, Mr. Chubb, your registers when the day is past shouting." The Reverend Chubb, who had not shouted for years, blushed. Mr. Crisp, moderate relief breathing through him like a stove, nodded. "Very good, Inspector. We shall minute that the police have been advised." Horace Plumbley of the Flaxborough Citizen had been scribbling phrases with the professional pleasure of a man who enjoyed the noise pencil made on paper. He had already produced mysterious parcel to council, brass warning to committee, and cemetery drama casts pal over drainage. He considered Bloodline and discarded it as too vampiric. Out in the corridor, the clerk who had brought the parcel was taken aside by Mr. Blee. "Who delivered?" asked Blee. "Boy on a bicycle," said the clerk. "Cap pulled down, said, 'For the committee,' and pushed off before I could advise him into civility." The clerk could advise many people into civility, always the same advice, always with diminishing effect. Pubright, who overheard without any visible attempt to do so, looked at the parcel wrapping. The brown paper had a faint trace of something that was not dust. Furniture polish. It had the particular perfumed smugness of drawing-room cleanliness. He did not touch the paper again. He had seen enough of it. Instead, he stooped to retrieve one of the tissue papers that had slipped to the floor and saw, on its torn edge, the small red smear, not of blood, but of sealing wax, the old-fashioned sort anyone could buy at the stationer's if they wanted their mischief to have dignity. He did not comment. Instead, he asked Mr. Puckle, who was hovering in proprietorial mourning, "Mortlake, did you say?" Merely another form of good business. The shop front displayed samples of their craft with the modest pride of artisans who understood that their customers, being deceased, were unlikely to complain about workmanship. Mr. Edgar Mortlake emerged from his workshop wearing a leather apron dusted with stone powder and the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit. His moustache conveyed both professional gravity and competitive pricing. "Inspector Pubright," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth that had clearly negotiated many such introductions. "You'll be wanting to know about those brass plates." "I am in want of a small education," Pubright replied, examining a display case of memorial samples. "Would you tell me whether these are yours by birth or imitation?" Mortlake peered at the evidence bag Pubright produced, then allowed satisfaction to settle on his features like dust on a mantelpiece. "Mortlake work, certainly. The lower serif, you see, and the way we take the burr off without flattening the edge. Your man had taste, I'll give him that." "When did he commission them?" 3 weeks past, paid in advance, cash money, said his eight. Name was Fordle, which seemed appropriate under the circumstances. Mortlake consulted a ledger whose pages bore the accumulated dignity of decades. Wanted 13 plates, same name, different inscriptions. Said it was for a family memorial project, showing how different folk might remember the same person. The explanation possessed the kind of reasonableness that made Pubright mildly suspicious of its sincerity. Did he seem familiar with memorial customs? Not particularly. Asked questions about brass composition, engraving depth, the sort of questions a customer asks when they want value but don't know the trade. Well-spoken fellow, though. Gloves, good ones. Smelt faintly of Turkish tobacco. And he collected them when? Yesterday morning, early. Said he needed them for a presentation. Mortlake's son, Victor, who had been hovering with the attentiveness of youth learning business, added, he brought his own wrapping. Brown paper, tissue, even straw. Said he wanted them protected proper-like. From Mortlake's, Pubright made his way to the offices of Crispin and Dart, where Mr. Roderick Crispin, the younger, received him in a room that smelled of leather bindings and accumulated legal wisdom. The Fordle file, efficiently located by Mr. Pounce, lay open between them like evidence of orderly conclusion. "Straightforward estate," said Mr. Crispin, consulting papers that bore the authority of proper stamps and signatures. Percival died, interstate in 1932, but there was only one heir of consequence. Edgar Fordle of Castlebridge, a commercial traveller, inherited the hat business and family property, sold both within the year. "Would you have a description of this Edgar Fordle?" Mr. Crispin's memory operated with the precision he applied to property boundaries. Thin gentleman, well-spoken, perhaps 40 at the time, which would make him approaching 70 now. Yet yesterday we had a visitor claiming to be Edgar Fordle. Wanted to review the estate papers, said he was concerned about some irregularity. I explained that the estate was long settled and that any irregularity would need specification. He left rather abruptly. This information settled into Purbright's consciousness with the weight of significance. "Would you recognize him again?" "Certainly, though I must say he seemed considerably younger than I would have expected. Time treats some people more kindly than others, of course, but this fellow couldn't have been much past 50. The vicarage proved Purbright's most illuminating stop. The Reverend Chubb, clearly unsettled by his proximity to irregularity, produced the burial register with hands that trembled slightly. Percival Fordle, buried December 4th, 1932, he confirmed, then paused with the expression of a man who had discovered something distasteful in his tea. "However, Inspector, I found this tucked between the pages. The handwritten note was fragile with age, its ink faded but legible. Fordle, Percival, interred December 7th, delay due to family travel." "The official record states the 4th, Pubright observed. "Indeed. And I've consulted Mrs. Pettigrew, who was a child then but remembers the funeral as sparsely attended. No family from afar, just a few townsfolk paying respects to the old family name. The cemetery yielded its own quiet testimony. Mr. Blee, interrupted in his maintenance of the orderly dead, walked with Pubright to the Fordle grave, where the headstone maintained its modest declaration of facts. "Ground settled proper," Blee confirmed, examining the earth with professional expertise. "Not been disturbed in my time, and I've been here 15 years. You can tell by how the grass grows." "That gentleman who claimed kinship yesterday," Pubright said. "Tell me about him." Blee leaned on his spade with the air of a man gathering observations. "Thin fellow, good clothes but not new. Spoke careful-like, as if he was remembering lines. Asked particular questions about the burial date. Seemed surprised when I said December 4th. Surprised how? Like he'd expected something different. Made a note in a little book, then stood looking at the stone as if it had disappointed him. As afternoon settled over Flaxborough, Pubright returned to the station to find Sergeant Love, waiting with the patient expression of a man who had fielded numerous inquiries from citizens whose curiosity exceeded their information. "Busy day, Sergeant?" 3 more people claiming connection to Fordle, 2 offers to buy the brass plates, and Mrs. Butterworth wondering if we shouldn't consult a medium. "The modern approach to detection," Pubright observed mildly. "What did you make of the relatives?" "Unconvincing. One thought Percival had died in the war, another claimed he'd been a baker." Pubright settled at his desk with the satisfaction of a man whose day had produced questions more interesting than answers. The mystery was developing complexity that suggested human nature at its most inventive. Someone was taking considerable trouble to draw attention to Percival Fordle, and the question was not merely who, but why such attention was worth the risk of discovery. The brass plates lay in their evidence bag, waiting to reveal their purpose, while somewhere in Flaxborough their sender pursued an agenda that remained as carefully concealed as the truth about when Percival Fordle had actually been laid to rest. The following morning brought Councillor Gearhart to the police station with the measured stride of a man who had devoted his breakfast to the arrangement of facts into commercially viable patterns. He carried a manila folder and wore the expression of someone who had applied the principles of successful drapery to the mysteries of human behavior. "Inspector," he announced, settling into the visitor's chair with the authority of a ratepayer addressing a public servant, "I believe we may conclude this Fordle matter with the efficiency it deserves." Pubright, who had been contemplating a report on bicycle thefts with the mild attention he applied to all evidence of human optimism, looked up with polite interest. "You have identified our sender." "I have applied method," Gearhart replied, opening his folder with the precision of a man displaying quality merchandise. "The facts arrange themselves quite sensibly when one considers who benefits from creating doubt about Percival Fordle's burial." He produced a sheet covered with his careful handwriting, the product of an evening spent treating mystery-like inventory. "Mrs. Millicent Fordle, Percival's sister-in-law. She contested the estate settlement in 1932, claiming Percival had promised her a portion of the family property. A compelling candidate," Pubright agreed. "What was the nature of her claim?" "She maintained that Percival had written her a letter promising Rose Cottage upon his death. When he died interstate, however, no such letter could be found. The estate passed to Edgar Fordle of Castlebridge as the law required." Gearhart consulted his notes with satisfaction. "Mrs. Fordle has nursed this grievance for 20 years. Who else would possess such intimate knowledge of the family's circumstances?" The theory possessed the architectural completeness that made Pubright mildly suspicious of its foundations. "Where might I find Mrs. Fordle?" "Rose Cottage, Meadow Lane. She takes in sewing and maintains a garden that suggests both precision and persistent resentment." After Gearhart's departure, Pubright made his way through streets where the morning carried whispers of the Fordle mystery like pollen on a gentle breeze. Rose Cottage proved to be a small establishment whose garden demonstrated the kind of militant order that suggested its owner's relationship with chaos was strictly adversarial. Mrs. Millicent Fordle received him at her door with the expression of someone who had been expecting official attention for 2 decades. She was a woman whose 70 years had been spent in the careful cultivation of both vegetables and grievances, with equal attention to proper maintenance. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had outlived most of her contemporaries and intended to make the survivors listen. "I wondered when you'd come calling." Her sitting room displayed photographs of Fordles in various stages of prosperity and decline, a genealogical exhibition that spoke of better days and persistent memory. She settled herself in a chair that clearly recognized her as its permanent and rightful occupant. "You'll want to know about Percival and the estate," she continued, with the directness of someone whose grievances had been properly rehearsed. "Everyone else has forgotten the family, but I remember everything. Tell me about your claim." Mrs. Fordle's expression acquired the focused intensity of someone whose injustices had been maintained through regular attention. "Percival promised me Rose Cottage in writing, Inspector, a proper letter witnessed by Mrs. Pettigrew from the post office. But when he died, sudden-like, that letter had vanished into thin air." She rose and retrieved a photograph from the mantelpiece, handling it with the reverence reserved for evidence. "That's Percival at the hat shop, 1930. Fine man, generous to family. He knew I'd been left poorly when Clarence passed." The photograph showed a thin man with careful eyes and the kind of moustache that suggested attention to detail. Pubright noted the resemblance to yesterday's cemetery visitor. "Have you had recent contact with Edgar Fordle?" "Edgar?" Mrs. Fordle's voice sharpened with genuine surprise. "Edgar died 3 years past, Inspector. Heart failure in Castlebridge. Made a point of reading his obituary in the Citizen. His widow sold up and moved to Bournemouth." This intelligence settled into Purbright's consciousness with the weight of significant revision. "You're quite certain?" "Certain as Sunday service. There's no Edgar Fordle left breathing, which makes yesterday's visitor to Mr. Crispin rather interesting, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does." "Who might have reason to impersonate Edgar?" Mrs. Fordle considered this with the careful attention of someone whose suspicions had finally found worthy employment. "Someone who knows the family history intimately, someone who understands the estate details well enough to ask the right questions. Do you have a candidate in mind?" "I have suspicions, Inspector, but suspicions aren't evidence." She paused, then added with the satisfaction of someone whose grievances had acquired fresh relevance. "Though I will say this. Whoever sent those brass plates knows more about Percival's death than the official records suggest." Pubright left Rose Cottage with the understanding that neat conclusions had a tendency to develop inconvenient complications. Mrs. Fordle possessed both motive and knowledge, but her grievances were 20 years old, and Edgar's death eliminated the most obvious target for inheritance fraud. Back at the station, Sergeant Love reported that the morning had brought 3 more false claimants and a woman insisting she had been Percival's secret correspondent. The mystery was attracting the kind of attention that suggested the town's imagination had found a new source of entertainment. "Half of Flaxborough will be claiming Fordle connections by week's end," Love observed, with the resignation of experience. Pubright contemplated the brass plates, which had succeeded admirably in their apparent purpose of drawing attention to Percival's grave, but attention to what end? The neat conclusion had proved insufficiently neat, leaving him with a dead Edgar, a living impostor, and 13 different ways of remembering the same man's burial. Someone was taking considerable trouble to complicate a 20-year-old death. And the question remained not merely who, but why such ancient business was worth the risk of present discovery. The neat conclusion had acquired inconvenient wrinkles, leaving Inspector Pubright with the kind of small inconsistencies that made him mildly suspicious of tidiness in general. He sat at his desk the following morning, contemplating the brown paper that had wrapped the brass plates. It retained that faint scent he had noticed initially, not the aggressive cleanliness of commercial polish, but something more domestic, more particular. The perfumed smugness of a drawing room where dust was considered a personal failing. He lifted the fragment of tissue paper he had retrieved from the committee room floor, examining again the small red smear of sealing wax. Not blood, as drama might have suggested, but something more interesting in its very ordinariness. The wax was of good quality, deep red with the smooth finish that came from proper warming and careful application. It spoke of someone who maintained old-fashioned habits in an increasingly modern world. "Sergeant Love," he called, "would you consult the calendar for December 1932? Specifically, what day of the week was the 4th? Love produced a perpetual calendar with the efficiency of a man who had learned that Inspector Purbright's requests, however peculiar, generally led somewhere useful. "Sunday, Inspector. December 4th was a Sunday. And the 7th, Wednesday." Pubright nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had found modest confirmation. "The burial register states December 4th, yet the Reverend informs me that Sunday burials are exceptional circumstances, the kind that require either epidemic, emergency, or unusual fee." He rose and made his way to the vicarage, where the Reverend Chubb received him with the nervous hospitality of a man whose records had already proved unreliable once. "December 4th, 1932, Pubright said, consulting the burial register. "A Sunday? Would your predecessor have conducted a Sunday burial as routine?" Chubb examined the entry with renewed attention. "Most irregular. The Reverend Makepeace was particular about the Sabbath. He would have noted any exceptional circumstances." He paused, then added with growing concern, "Inspector, I begin to suspect our records have been more accommodating than accurate." From the vicarage, Pubright made his way to Latchford's, the stationer's, where Mr. Latchford maintained the kind of establishment that sold proper writing materials to people who understood their importance. "Sealing wax?" Pubright inquired with the casual interest of a customer. "Do you stock the traditional varieties?" "Indeed, though the demand has diminished considerably. We had a gentleman purchase oxblood red just this week. Very particular about the shade. Wanted something properly blood-coloured, as he put it." "Would you describe this gentleman?" Latchford's memory operated with the precision of a man who appreciated quality in both merchandise and customers. "Well-dressed, careful manners, wore gloves, good ones, tobacco scent about him, Turkish variety. He also purchased card blanks, the visiting size." The description aligned with the mysterious Edgar from the solicitor's office and cemetery. Pubright thanked Latchford and continued to Rowbotham's tobacco shop, where the proprietor confirmed the sale of Turkish tobacco to a gentleman matching the same description. "Asked about hotels in Castlebridge," Rowbotham added. "I recommended the Crown as tolerable." At the offices of the Flaxborough Citizen, Horace Plumbley assisted with the weary efficiency of a journalist whose best story was proving disappointingly complex. The December 1932 archives revealed Percival Fordle's obituary. Death on December 2nd, funeral announced for December 7th. "The newspaper states the 7th, Pubright observed. "The burial register claims the 4th. "Newspapers can err," Plumbley suggested defensively. "Deadlines, you understand." But Pubright had noticed something else, a small advertisement, dated December 5th. "Fordle & Sons Hatters, closing down sale, all stock must go." The business was advertised for closure before the funeral, he noted. Remarkable efficiency in grief. Back at the station, he arranged the small discoveries like pieces of a puzzle whose picture remained unclear. The sealing wax suggested someone who valued traditional formality. The furniture polish scent implied domestic fastidiousness. The Sunday burial discrepancy indicated either emergency circumstances or deliberate misdirection. The Turkish tobacco and good gloves painted a portrait of refined tastes and careful habits. Someone is taking considerable trouble to appear respectable while conducting disreputable business, he observed to Sergeant Love. The question is whether our mysterious gentleman is correcting an old deception or perpetrating a new one. The brass plates lay in their evidence bag, their multiple inscriptions now seeming less like confusion and more like documentation. 13 different ways of remembering the same death, as if someone wanted to ensure that every possible version of events was properly memorialized. Pubright considered the psychology of someone who would use sealing wax on a package delivered. By bicycle, who would commission memorial plates with cash while wearing expensive gloves, who would impersonate a dead man to examine legal documents. It suggested a person caught between genuine respect for propriety and necessary deception, someone for whom maintaining appearances was both habit and camouflage. The mystery was developing the kind of complexity that suggested human nature at its most inventive. Someone had waited 20 years to draw attention to Percival Fordle's grave, and the accumulating evidence suggested this patience had been both deliberate and necessary. As afternoon settled over Flaxborough, Pubright reflected that the most significant clues were often the smallest ones, the unconscious habits that revealed character more clearly than any deliberate action. The sealing wax, the furniture polish, the Sunday that should have been Wednesday, trivial details that whispered of deeper deceptions waiting to be uncovered. The accumulating details had begun to suggest that Inspector Pubright's investigation might benefit from a broader canvas of human testimony. The sealing wax, the furniture polish, the Sunday that should have been Wednesday, these fragments pointed not toward a single culprit, but toward a conspiracy of circumstances that had been carefully maintained for 20 years. He began with Mrs. Pettigrew, now retired to a cottage on Elm Street where she tended prize-winning fuchsias and an encyclopedic memory for local indiscretions. Her parlour smelled of lavender and contained an alarming number of porcelain shepherdesses, each positioned with the precision of someone who understood that modest means required exceptional maintenance. "The Fordle letter," she confirmed, with satisfaction. "I witnessed it myself." Percival was most particular about proper procedure. Red sealing wax, the decent oxblood shade, applied with a little brass seal engraved with the letter F. The document promised Rose Cottage to Mrs. Millicent. Upon his death, clear as daylight. What became of this letter? Mrs. Pettigrew's expression acquired the focused indignation of someone whose professional integrity had been questioned by events. Vanished, Inspector. Simply vanished between his death and the estate settlement. Edgar Fordle claimed no such document existed, but I know what I witnessed. From Mrs. Pettigrew, Pubright made his way to the offices of Hibbins and Associates, where young Mr. Aubrey Hibbins conducted insurance business from premises that gleamed, with the kind of aggressive cleanliness that suggested prosperity was a recent acquisition. "I maintain the old courtesies," Hibbins explained, indicating a writing desk equipped with red sealing wax, a brass seal engraved F, and a paper knife bearing traces of claret-coloured residue. Clients trust what appears established. Few sentiments prove so commercially viable. The seal was identical to Mrs. Pettigrew's description, yet Hibbins could hardly have inherited it legitimately. Pubright noted the Turkish tobacco scent that lingered about the office and the expensive gloves folded beside the blotter. "You've taken an interest in the Fordle estate?" "Professional curiosity, Inspector. Old property policies sometimes reveal Forgotten assets, I've been reviewing records, yes. Remarkable what people settle and then forget. At Gearhart's drapery, Miss Clarissa Gearhart received inquiries with the cautious precision of someone whose stock consisted largely of memory. Her floors bore the violet-scented polish that had clung to the brass plates wrapping. "That gentleman who purchased mourning gloves?" Pubright mentioned casually. "Size 8, narrow hands, paid cash and asked about the polish we use. Said he appreciated establishments that maintain proper standards." She paused, then added with commercial satisfaction, "Violet wax, civilized. Customers dare not sneeze here." The funeral establishment yielded its own testimony. Mr. Puckle consulted records inherited from his father with the reverence due to family tradition and commercial precedent. "Father noted unusual circumstances," he confirmed. 5 days between death and burial with special preservation arrangements. Most irregular. The family paid additional fees, but Father recorded his concerns about the delay. What sort of concerns? The ground had been disturbed before the official burial. Someone had been conducting preliminary excavations, as if checking the grave's suitability. At the vicarage, the Reverend Chubb produced additional evidence of irregularity. "I've discovered another discrepancy," he admitted, with the nervous precision of someone whose records had proved unreliable. The burial fee was paid twice, once on December 4th, once on December 7th. Most peculiar. Mrs. Hester Gable, Percival's former housekeeper, received Pubright in a terraced house that smelled of carbolic soap and righteous indignation. Her testimony carried the authority of someone who had spent 30 years maintaining other people's secrets. "Edgar Fordle descended like a wolf," she declared. "Arrived before the funeral, rummaging through Mr. Percival's papers. Had a particular smell about him, Turkish tobacco and something sharp, like chemicals, found what he was looking for, and burned a stack of documents in the back garden, including the letter to Mrs. Millicent, among others. I saw him examining papers by candlelight, selecting some for destruction. Very methodical about it, as if he knew exactly what to eliminate. The most intriguing testimony came from Mr. Arthur Pinch, a retired accountant whose memory for financial irregularities remained professionally acute. The estate settlement was remarkably swift, he recalled. Edgar handled everything through a London solicitor, claimed the local firm was incompetent, sold the business within a week to a consortium that paid cash and asked no questions. Doubt. You recall the consortium's name? Bramwell Holdings. Never heard of them before or since. The whole transaction had the efficiency of something planned well in advance. As evening settled over Flaxborough, Pubright reflected that the investigation had expanded beyond simple inheritance fraud to encompass a more complex deception. The mysterious Edgar, who had settled the estate in 1932, bore striking similarities to the current imposter. The same Turkish tobacco, the same careful gloves, the same methodical approach to document examination. Someone had been maintaining this deception for 20 years, and the brass plates represented not the beginning of mischief, but its culmination. The question was no longer who had sent them, but why someone had finally decided that Percival Fordle's carefully buried secrets deserved resurrection. The town's respectable surface concealed grievances and deceptions that had been fermenting, quietly for 2 decades, waiting for the right moment to demand attention. That moment, it seemed, had finally arrived. The night had settled over Flaxborough with the kind of persistent drizzle that made sensible citizens grateful for proper roofs and encouraged only the most necessary of outdoor activities. It was, therefore, with considerable reluctance that Mr. Puddleham, foreman of the corporation's night soil collection, found himself contemplating the blocked gully behind what had once been Fordle & Sons, Hatters, at 4:30 in the morning. The gully had been reported obstructed for the third time in as many weeks, a circumstance that offended Mr. Puddleham's professional sensibilities. He approached the corroded grating with the grim determination of a man for whom municipal drainage was both employment and philosophy, accompanied by his assistant, young Tomkins, who possessed strong shoulders and weak opinions about early morning adventures. The grating surrendered with the metallic protest of iron that had negotiated many seasons. Mr. Puddleham inserted his hook and drew up not the expected aggregate of leaves and urban detritus, but a parcel wrapped in brown paper and bound with string that had clearly been chosen for durability rather than elegance. Not the usual, observed Tomkins, who had developed a professional appreciation for the predictable nature of municipal waste. Mr. Puddleham placed the parcel on the cart's tailboard with the delicacy of someone whose experience had taught him that unexpected discoveries were rarely pleasant ones. The string was cut with his penknife, the paper peeled back to reveal contents that made him pause in the manner of a man reconsidering his relationship with the mysterious. There were gloves, gentlemen's gloves of dark kid leather, bearing the defeated appearance of quality merchandise that had attempted concealment in unsuitable circumstances. There was a small brass seal bearing the letter F, its face clogged with red wax that had been darkened by moisture, but retained enough clarity to suggest recent use. Most intriguingly, there were 13 slips of cartridge paper, each bearing the name Percival Fordle, 1879-1932, in careful copperplate, with different sentiments penciled beneath. At rest, calmly gone, beside his dear mother, too soon, and various burial dates ranging from December 4th to December 9th. Mr. Puddleham, whose philosophy encompassed both municipal efficiency and the preservation of evidence, rewrapped the parcel and made directly for the police station, where he arrived to find that the morning had already provided Sergeant Love with complications of its own. For at 6 o'clock precisely, Mr. Blee had discovered that someone had conducted unauthorized archaeology in Section B of the cemetery. The earth before Percival Fordle's headstone bore clear evidence of nocturnal excavation, not the crude work of treasure hunters, but the methodical investigation of someone who understood both soil composition and the importance of restoration. The turf had been lifted in careful sections and replaced with the kind of attention to detail that suggested professional experience. However, the morning's persistent drizzle had revealed the disturbance, and lying on the grass, apparently overlooked by whoever had conducted the operation, was a short brass screw of the type used to secure coffin fittings. Inspector Pubright arrived at the cemetery to find Mr. Blee guarding the site with the proprietary indignation of a man whose domain had been subjected to unauthorized improvement. The brass screw lay in an evidence envelope, while the disturbed earth told its story with the clarity of a confession written in soil. Professional work, Pubright observed, examining the careful restoration. Someone who understood both the objective and the necessity of concealment. At the coffin level, Blee confirmed with professional precision, or near enough to matter. From the cemetery, Pubright proceeded to the depot, where Mr. Puddleham's discovery awaited examination. The gloves proved to be size 8, narrow hands with stitching that spoke of Gerhardt's craftsmanship. Despite their recent immersion, they retained the faint ghost of Turkish tobacco, and beneath it the civilized hint of violet polish that had become a signature of their mysterious owner. The brass seal bore the letter F with crisp precision, fragments of ox-blood wax remaining in the recesses alongside traces of talc, as if whoever had used it had powdered their hands before the work. The 13 paper slips were clearly drafts, practice runs for the brass plates that had initiated the investigation, written in the disciplined hand of someone with commercial training. At Gearhart's drapery, Miss Clarissa confirmed the gloves, provenance with the satisfaction of someone whose memory for merchandise was both comprehensive and accurate. Purchased last week by a gentleman who complimented our violet polish, Turkish tobacco about him, and very particular about counting his change. The evidence pointed inexorably toward Mr. Aubrey Hibbins, whose office maintained the same violet polish, whose hands bore the telltale traces of talc, and whose possession of sealing wax and visiting cards had been previously established. Yet Pubright found himself contemplating not merely the identity of their mysterious correspondent, but the deeper question of motivation. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to draw attention to Percival Fordle's grave, commissioning brass plates, conducting nocturnal excavations and disposing of evidence in a manner calculated to ensure discovery. The question was whether this elaborate performance was designed to expose an old deception or perpetrate a new one. The brass screw suggested that someone had either attempted to access the coffin or wanted others to believe such an attempt had been made. The carefully preserved drafts indicated planning that extended far beyond simple mischief. The gloves and seal, disposed of in a location that virtually guaranteed discovery, suggested either carelessness or deliberate revelation. As Pubright returned to the station, he reflected that the case had evolved beyond simple inheritance fraud. Someone was conducting an elaborate campaign to resurrect not merely Percival Fordle's memory, but secrets that had been buried with considerable care 20 years earlier. The question was whether those secrets deserved resurrection, and what price their revelation might exact from Flaxborough's carefully maintained respectability. The brass plates lay in their evidence bag, their purpose now clearer, but their ultimate objective still shrouded in the kind of complexity that suggested human nature at its most inventive and persistent. The evening found Inspector Pubright in his kitchen, where the kettle's gentle murmur provided a companionable counterpoint to his contemplations. He had arranged the day's discoveries on his modest table with the care of a man who understood that truth often emerged not from dramatic revelation, but from the patient consideration of accumulated detail. The brass plates lay in their evidence bag, 13 different ways of remembering the same death, each variation a small rebellion against the official record. Beside them, the brass screw that had tasted morning dew after its nocturnal displacement, the gloves that carried the ghost of violet polish and Turkish tobacco, the seal that had pressed its authority into oxblood wax. Each piece possessed its own modest clarity, yet together they formed a narrative that resisted simple interpretation. Pubright poured his tea and reflected on the psychology of someone who would conduct deception while wearing expensive gloves. It suggested a person for whom respectability was both habit and camouflage, someone who valued appearances even while engaged in their systematic destruction. The Turkish tobacco spoke of cultivated tastes, the violet polish of domestic fastidiousness, the sealing wax of someone who maintained old courtesies in an increasingly informal world. This was not the work of common criminality, but of patient obsession, the kind that fermented quietly in respectable drawing rooms for 20 years before demanding resolution. Someone had been nursing a grievance with the dedication others applied to prize roses, tending it through seasons of apparent dormancy until the moment arrived for its public flowering. The evidence pointed increasingly toward Mr. Aubrey Hibbins, whose office displayed the same violet polish, whose hands bore talc traces from sealing wax, whose possession of the F-engraved seal had been established. Yet Hibbins himself remained something of a puzzle, a young man conducting business with the methodical precision of someone far older, maintaining traditions he could hardly have inherited. The mysterious Edgar, who had settled the estate in the 1932 possessed characteristics that aligned remarkably with their current correspondent. The same Turkish tobacco, the same careful gloves, the same methodical approach to document examination. Mrs. Fordle's certainty that Edgar had died 3 years earlier suggested either remarkable longevity or remarkable deception. Someone had been maintaining a fiction for decades, and the brass plates represented not the beginning of revelation, but its culmination. Pubright considered the social architecture of Flaxborough, where secrets were maintained not by silence, but by selective memory and polite omission. The Fordle mystery had attracted attention precisely because it challenged the town's comfortable assumption that the dead stayed buried and the past remained settled. Someone was insisting that old business required new attention, and the community was responding with the nervous fascination that suggested collective complicity. The nocturnal excavation at Percival's grave spoke of someone who understood both, the necessity of verification and the importance of theatrical presentation. The brass screw, apparently overlooked, might have been genuinely lost or deliberately planted as evidence. The careful restoration of turf indicated professional competence, yet discovery was virtually inevitable given the morning's persistent drizzle. This contradiction between concealment and revelation characterized the entire affair. Someone was simultaneously hiding and exposing, conducting elaborate deceptions while ensuring their discovery. It suggested a person caught between the necessity of maintaining old lies and the compulsion to reveal buried truths. The timeline troubled him most. Why now, after 20 years of apparent dormancy? The death of the original Edgar 3 years earlier might have provided the catalyst, removing the last witness to whatever deception had been perpetrated in 1932. Or perhaps some property matter was ripening at last, forgotten covenants, reversionary interests, the kind of legal archaeology that occasionally disturbed apparently settled estates. Mrs. Pettigrew's testimony about the witnessed letter carried the authority of professional indignation. She had seen Percival promise Rose Cottage to Mrs. Millicent, had watched the red wax seal applied with ceremonial precision, had witnessed a document that vanished between death and settlement. The burning of papers in Edgar's back garden, observed by the housekeeper, suggested systematic elimination of inconvenient evidence. The multiple burial dates on the brass plates, the Sunday entry where Wednesday would serve, the double payment of burial fees, these suggested that Percival Fordle's interment had been more complicated than the official record indicated. Perhaps the body buried on December 4th was not Percival's at all, or perhaps Percival had died earlier than recorded, requiring preservation until a more convenient burial date could be arranged. As the kettle settled into silence, Pubright reflected that the most complex crimes were often the most human ones, driven not by simple greed, but by the kind of persistent grievances that could ferment quietly for decades before demanding resolution. Someone had constructed an elaborate performance designed to draw attention to carefully buried secrets, and that someone possessed both the patience of the obsessed and the theatrical instincts of the naturally dramatic. The question was not merely who had sent the plates, but what truth they were meant to reveal, and whether that truth was worth the elaborate deception required to expose it. Tomorrow would bring opportunities for gentle inquiry, the kind of polite questioning that might encourage someone to reveal more than they intended. He finished his tea with the quiet satisfaction of a problem not yet solved, but properly understood. Somewhere in Flaxborough, someone was waiting for the next movement in a carefully orchestrated symphony of revelation, and Inspector Pubright intended to ensure that when it came, he would be listening with appropriate attention. The following morning brought Inspector Pubright to the offices of Hibbins and Associates with the measured purpose of a man who had spent the previous evening arranging evidence like pieces on a chessboard. He carried a manila envelope whose contents represented the accumulated weight of small discoveries, and wore the expression of someone whose professional curiosity had ripened into focused attention. Mr. Aubrey Hibbins received him with the careful courtesy of a businessman who understood that police visits, however politely conducted, were seldom entirely social. His office maintained its characteristic violet-scented gleam, the writing desk arranged with the precision of someone for whom order served as both habit and camouflage. "Inspector," Hibbins said, indicating a chair with measured hospitality. "How may I assist you this morning?" Pubright settled himself with deliberate comfort and produced from his envelope the brass screw that had been discovered beside Percival Fordle's grave. He placed it on the polished desk with the casual precision of someone displaying evidence that required no dramatic emphasis. "I wondered whether you might comment on this particular item," he said, with the mild interest of genuine inquiry. Hibbins examined the screw with careful attention, his hands remaining steady, though Pubright noted the slight tightening around, his eyes that suggested recognition wrestling with discretion. The highly polished surface of the desk seemed to reflect the small piece of metal with disproportionate significance. "A brass screw," Hibbins observed with professional neutrality. "Well made, the threading suggests quality manufacture." "Indeed. We found it beside Mr. Fordle's grave, following some nocturnal excavation. Someone had taken considerable care to restore the turf, yet overlooked this small detail." Pubright paused, allowing the silence to develop weight. Rather careless for such methodical work. From the envelope he produced the gloves recovered from the gully, still bearing their evidence bags. "Size 8, narrow hands, purchased at Gearhart's last week. They retain traces of violet polish, the same variety you use here, I believe." Hibbins studied the gloves with the kind of attention that suggested familiarity wrestling with prudence. His own hands, Pubright noted, bore the telltale traces of talc that suggested recent contact with sealing wax. "Many establishments use quality polish, Inspector. It inspires confidence in clients." "Quite so." Pubright produced the brass seal bearing the letter F. This accompanied the gloves. The wax residue indicates recent use, oxblood red, applied with considerable skill. The silence that followed possessed the quality of a held breath. Hibbins rose and moved to his window, where he stood contemplating the street with the air of someone whose careful plans had encountered an unexpected obstacle. "You maintain similar materials here," Pubright observed, indicating the sealing wax and seal visible on Hibbins's desk. "The old courtesies, as you mentioned." "Professional necessity," Hibbins replied, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone whose explanations had been prepared well in advance. "Clients trust what appears established." Pubright retrieved one of the practice slips found in the gully, the paper bearing Percival Fordle's name in careful copper plate. "Would you comment on the handwriting?" Hibbins examined the slip with professional detachment. "Commercial training, the sort taught in better schools, disciplined, consistent. Rather like your own, I should think." Pubright's observation carried no accusation, merely the gentle pressure of accumulated evidence seeking acknowledgement. The young man returned to his chair, his movements betraying the first signs of strain beneath his composed exterior. The paperweight on his desk caught the morning light, casting small rainbows that seemed incongruously cheerful given the circumstances. "Inspector," Hibbins said carefully, "I hope you don't suspect me of some impropriety regarding the Fordle matter. My interest has been purely professional. Old property policies sometimes reveal forgotten complications." Of course, Pubright gathered his evidence with unhurried precision. "Though I find it curious that someone would go to such elaborate lengths to draw attention to a 20-year-old burial. The brass plates, the nocturnal excavation, the careful disposal of evidence in locations that virtually guaranteed discovery. He paused, allowing his gaze to rest on Hibbins with the mild attention of an instructor waiting for a student's response. It suggests someone who wanted the truth revealed but lacked the courage for direct disclosure. Hibbins's carefully maintained composure showed hairline cracks like porcelain subjected to temperature change. His hand moved unconsciously toward the F seal on his desk, then withdrew as if the metal had burned him. "The community deserves resolution," he said finally. "Old mysteries can fester like untreated wounds." "Indeed they can." Pubright rose, with the unhurried grace of someone whose work was proceeding according to plan. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hibbins. Most illuminating as always." He moved toward the door, then paused with the air of someone remembering a trivial detail. "Oh, one small matter. Should you decide that complete honesty might serve your interests, better than continued discretion, you'll find me quite receptive to reasonable explanations." The door closed behind him with the soft finality of a well-made mechanism. Outside, the morning air carried the promise of rain, and Inspector Pubright walked with the satisfaction of a man whose small splinter had found its mark. The test had been administered with appropriate delicacy, and the results, while not yet complete, suggested that resolution was approaching with the inevitability of weather. In his office, Aubrey, Hibbins sat alone with the lingering scent of violet polish and the uncomfortable weight of evidence that had been presented with such devastating politeness. The brass screw seemed to gleam with accusatory significance, a small but undeniable reminder that even the most careful deceptions eventually encountered the patient persistence of truth. The committee room had been arranged with the kind of deliberate informality that suggested serious business conducted under civilized circumstances. Inspector Pubright had requested the gathering with his characteristic politeness, and the assembled company had responded with the mixture of curiosity and apprehension that such invitations typically inspired. Mrs. Millicent Fordle occupied her chair with the erect dignity of someone whose grievances had finally achieved official recognition. Mr. Mostyn Crisp sat with his notebook prepared to chronicle whatever could be made administratively tidy. The Reverend Chubb hovered near, the tea urn as if spiritual comfort might be dispensed alongside refreshment. Mr. Blee had positioned himself with the patient resignation of someone whose domain had been thoroughly disrupted by other people's mysteries. Mr. Aubrey Hibbins arrived precisely on time, his usual composure intact, but carrying the subtle tension of someone whose carefully constructed world was about to undergo significant revision. Pubright began without ceremony, laying the brass plates on the table where they caught the afternoon light with metallic authority. "We have," he observed mildly, "a death recorded in multiple ways and remembered in 13 different fashions. This multiplicity, as it transpires, was neither accident nor caprice, but a deliberate attempt to draw attention to carefully buried truths." He lifted one of the plates, examining its engraved sentiment with scholarly interest. Percival Fordle, hatter, died on December 2nd, 1932. The newspaper announced his funeral for December 7th, a Wednesday, which would have been appropriate for such proceedings. However, the burial register records December 4th, a Sunday, which would have required exceptional circumstances and additional fees. The Reverend Chubb coloured slightly, his professional pride having been wounded by the discovery of irregularities in his predecessor's records. "The cemetery received payment twice," Pubright continued, "once for December 4th, once for December 7th. Mr. Blee's recent examination of the grave revealed evidence of disturbance, both historical and contemporary. Someone had been taking considerable interest in the precise circumstances of Percival's interment." From his evidence bag, he produced the brass screw that had been discovered beside the grave. This small item, apparently overlooked during nocturnal excavation, belongs to coffin fittings of the type used in 1932. Its presence suggests that someone had accessed the burial site with specific knowledge of what they might find. Hibbins sat with the stillness of someone whose careful plans had encountered their inevitable conclusion. "The gloves recovered from the municipal gully," Pubright said, producing them with unhurried precision, "bore traces of violet polish, the same variety used by Gearhart's drapery and maintained in Mr. Hibbins' office. They also retained the scent of Turkish tobacco, a preference shared by our mysterious correspondent." He placed the brass seal on the table with ceremonial care. This seal, bearing the letter F, was used to authenticate the red wax found on the tissue paper. Mrs. Pettigrew witnessed such a seal being used by Percival to authenticate a letter promising Rose Cottage to Mrs. Millicent. That letter, along with other inconvenient documents, was destroyed by Edgar Fordle during his swift settlement of the estate. Mrs. Millicent leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose long-nursed grievances were finally receiving proper acknowledgement. Edgar Fordle, Pubright explained, was indeed Percival's cousin and legitimate heir, but only in the absence of valid testamentary provisions. The letter witnessed by Mrs. Pettigrew would have complicated his inheritance considerably. His solution was both swift and thorough. Destroy the inconvenient documents, settle the estate through a London solicitor who asked few questions, and liquidate the assets through Bramwell Holdings, a company that existed precisely long enough to facilitate the transaction. "But Edgar died 3 years ago," Mrs. Millicent interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had verified the obituary personally. "Indeed he did," Pubright agreed. "Which brings us to Mr. Hibbins, who has been conducting this elaborate campaign of revelation with the dedication of someone whose conscience had been properly educated in family history." All attention focused on Hibbins, who finally spoke with the careful precision of someone whose explanations had been long rehearsed. "My grandfather, Edgar, was a man of business efficiency and selective morality. Upon his death I inherited not merely his estate, but his detailed journals documenting the 1932 deception. He had recorded everything with the thoroughness of someone who took pride in successful fraud. And you decided to correct his work? I discovered that Mrs. Millicent was still alive, still residing in circumstances that my grandfather's theft had rendered unnecessarily modest. The knowledge became unbearable, but direct confession seemed impossible. How does one approach an elderly lady and announce that one's grandfather was a systematic thief?" Hibbins opened a manila folder and produced documents that bore the weight of decades-old guilt. The brass plates were designed to draw attention to the discrepancies in the burial records. The nocturnal excavation was intended to verify my grandfather's journal entries about the hasty reburial necessitated by his document destruction. The deliberately planted evidence was meant to ensure police investigation without requiring me to make direct accusations against family. "A rather elaborate form of anonymous confession," Pubright observed. "I inherited my grandfather's preference for indirect methods, Inspector. Turkish tobacco, quality gloves, proper sealing wax, these were his habits, maintained as a form of penance. I thought if I could make the town question the official records, truth would emerge without destroying reputations unnecessarily." Mr. Crisp, who had been following the explanation with professional interest, cleared his throat diplomatically. "The legal remedies for such historical irregularities are not beyond possibility. Where fraud can be demonstrated and acknowledged, equitable adjustment remains feasible." Mrs. Millicent studied Hibbins with the expression of someone whose opinion of human nature was undergoing modest revision. "You could have simply knocked on my door, young man." "I could have," Hibbins admitted, "but I lacked the courage for such directness." The brass plates seemed safer than conversation. Pubright gathered the evidence with the satisfaction of a problem properly solved. The 13 inscriptions represented 13 different ways of avoiding the truth. Your grandfather's efficiency in disposing of inconvenient facts multiplied by your own reluctance to address them directly. Precisely, Inspector. Well then, said Mrs. Millicent with the brisk authority of someone whose patience had limits, we shall proceed with practical remedies. Mr. Crisp will prepare whatever documents restore Rose Cottage to its proper ownership. Mr. Hibbins will abandon elaborate symbolism in favor of straightforward reparation, and we shall all pretend that 20 years of injustice can be corrected by afternoon tea and proper paperwork. The meeting concluded with the kind of civilized efficiency that made complex moral problems seem manageable through administrative procedure. Outside, Flaxborough continued its respectable routines, unaware that one of its most carefully maintained deceptions had finally been resolved through the patient application of conscience and proper investigation. The weeks following the Fordle, revelations settled over Flaxborough with the measured calm of a community that had successfully converted scandal into administrative procedure. Mr. Crisp, with the satisfaction of a man whose filing systems had proven adequate to human complexity, corrected the burial registers with annotations that transformed mystery into mere clerical adjustment. The brass plates found dignified retirement in the municipal archives, where they joined other evidence of the town's capacity for maintaining civilized appearances while conducting necessary business. Mrs. Millicent Fordle accepted the restoration of Rose Cottage with the dignity of someone whose grievances had finally achieved proper recognition. She declined to occupy the property herself, preferring the familiarity of her current residence, but arranged for its rental to a young couple whose appreciation for historical significance exceeded their concern for historical irregularities. The modest income provided comfortable supplementation to her declining years, and she took particular satisfaction in tending the cottage garden, which responded to justice with unseasonable enthusiasm. Mr. Aubrey Hibbins continued his insurance practice with the lightened step of someone whose conscience had been properly unburdened. His office retained its violet-scented gleam, though the sealing wax and brass seal were quietly retired in favor of more conventional correspondence methods. His Turkish tobacco habit persisted as personal preference rather than inherited penance, and he discovered that honesty, while initially uncomfortable, proved remarkably compatible with commercial success. His clients, apparently, appreciated the novelty of dealing with someone whose complicated past had been voluntarily disclosed rather than accidentally discovered. The cemetery committee resumed its monthly deliberations with renewed attention to drainage, having exhausted its appetite for mysteries that could not be solved through proper engineering. Mr. Blee's subsoil drain proposal was approved with administrative efficiency that suggested the committee preferred problems requiring excavation to those demanding archaeological investigation. The Fordle grave, meticulously restored, attracted occasional visitors who regarded it with the respectful curiosity reserved for local landmarks whose significance exceeded their appearance. The Reverend Chubb commissioned a comprehensive review of burial registers, a project that revealed minor discrepancies dating from various periods, but nothing approaching the systematic irregularities of the Fordle case. His faith in ecclesiastical record-keeping was restored through the discovery that most errors resulted from clerical oversight rather than deliberate deception, a distinction that provided considerable comfort to his professional sensibilities. The Lamb and Flag, the story had evolved through multiple tellings into something approaching local legend, with each narrator adding embellishments that reflected their particular understanding of human nature and criminal behavior. Mr. Cyril Wembury had learned that mysteries, properly managed, could provide weeks of conversational material, though he privately hoped that Flaxborough's respectable surface concealed no further secrets requiring similar investigation. Mrs. Butterworth discovered that her talent for distributing information could be applied to collecting local history and began interviewing elderly residents about their memories of past irregularities. Her efforts produced a modest archive of gossip, speculation, and carefully preserved scandal that would provide future generations with insight into the town's capacity for maintaining polite silence about inconvenient truths. Horace Plumbley, of the Flaxborough Citizen, had produced a series of articles about local history that managed to discuss the Fordle case without mentioning specific names or compromising details. His approach demonstrated the possibility of journalism that informed, without sensationalizing, a balance that proved both commercially viable and professionally satisfying. The brass plates were eventually donated to the Flaxborough Museum, where they were displayed as curious testament to the complexity of family conscience and the persistence of buried truth. The municipal buildings acquired new policies regarding anonymous packages, with the Porter's Lodge instructed to record delivery details and notify police of items designed to create mystery rather than provide information. This administrative adjustment reflected the town's collective understanding that while mysteries could be entertaining, they were best resolved through proper investigation rather than speculation. Mrs. Pettigrew found her memory for local events suddenly valued by residents seeking testimony about historical irregularities. Her parlour became an informal archive of Flaxborough's past indiscretions, though she maintained the discretion that had made her valuable as witness and trusted as keeper of confidences. Inspector Pubright returned to routine duties with quiet satisfaction, his desk bearing the usual accumulation of reports concerning bicycle thefts, domestic disputes, and minor commercial irregularities. These problems seemed refreshingly straightforward after the elaborate deceptions of the Fordle matter. He reflected that the case had demonstrated both the complexity of human motivation and the ultimate effectiveness of patient investigation. The 13 different ways of remembering Percival Fordle had been reduced to one: a man whose death had been complicated by family greed, but whose memory had finally been served by family conscience. As autumn settled over Flaxborough, the town's collective memory began incorporating the mystery into its ongoing narrative of respectable eccentricity and minor scandal. The drainage work in Section D proceeded with admirable efficiency, revealing nothing more mysterious than accumulated detritus and occasional Victorian coins. Mr. Blee supervised with professional satisfaction, grateful that his domain had returned to problems solvable through proper excavation rather than historical investigation. Outside Purbright's window, Flaxborough continued its measured pace, surface respectability intact, but perhaps slightly more aware of the complex currents flowing beneath ordinary life. The brass plates lay in their archive, waiting to remind future investigators that truth, however elaborately concealed, possessed a persistent tendency toward eventual revelation.